subtitle is Executive Functions and Academic Achievement in Children with ADHD. As you all know, ADHD is intimately linked to ASD, autism spectrum disorder. So the presentation outline is as follows. First, we are going to talk about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or else ADHD. Then we are going to proceed with the delimitation of the term executive functions, and we will try to detect the relations between executive functions and academic skills in general, but then try to see the interactions among ADHD symptoms, executive functions, and academic skills. To begin with, ADHD is one of the most common disorders in childhood, and it overruns multiple fields of people's lives. In more detail, ADHD affects academic and work performance, along, of course, with social functioning. So we can see many difficulties of children and generally individuals with ADHD as far as relationships, peer relationships are concerned, and we may also have delinquent behaviors. ADHD varies, first of all, in the intensity of the symptoms, in the kind of symptoms each individual experiences, and of course, in the manifestation of the symptoms across lifespan. We can distinguish three main types of ADHD. So we have the mainly inattentive type, the predominantly hyperactive type, and the combined type. The latter is the most prominent form of ADHD. Of course, the particular developmental disorder is more prominent in boys rather than girls. Then, as far as the developmental disorder of ADHD is concerned, we have seen various impairments, including executive function impairments, language impairments, problem in interpersonal relationships, and of course, academic underachievement. The linguistic impairments are not a part of the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. However, it is very important that we have substantial evidence suggesting that we have language impairments, and in more detail, we have difficulties in discourse organization, in articulation, in phonological awareness, phonological processing, in syntax, and of course in pragmatics. Pragmatics are an area that is deficient in ASD as well. We also can see some difficulties in mathematical achievement. And now, moving on to executive functions, this term includes a set of higher order skills that allows the generation, supervision, regulation, and implementation of certain behaviors in order for individuals to achieve complex goals. And the term refers to not automated processes that allow us to adapt to new situations. This is a very broad term, and in research, researchers try to delve into core executive functions. However, we see that there is not a unitary or the categorization of core executive functions. So this is why we have included here specific indicative, I would say, categorizations of core EFs. So in most cases, we see that core executive functions include inhibition, shifting, and working memory. Shifting may also be evident as flexibility. Some researchers also include planning. And when it comes to the research in ADHD, we also have the inclusion of attentional control, since this is a deficient area in a particular developmental disorder. Now, executive functions affect both school and everyday life, moving on to children, and they can predict academic and occupational outcomes even in young adulthood. Executive functions can exert an important influence throughout our life, and they are very important because if we trace differences in executive functions from a preschool, even from a preschool age in kindergarten, we will be able to design better interventions. So early executive function difficulties in kindergarten have been linked to later reading and mathematics underachievement in grade 1. We need to say that literacy and becoming literate is a very complex process, and it calls for the allocation of different cognitive resources. It calls also for language skills and other important skills in our life. Now, different executive functions, of course, relate to different reading skills. Reading comprehension is one of the most complex reading skills because apart from word reading, it calls for executive functions. So reading comprehension involves also the strategic allocation of attention. It calls for the retrieval of background information, the mental organization and representation of a text. And we also have, we moreover have indications of proficient readers in terms of fluency. So we have fluent readers who may lack understanding of a text. So this is again one indication that EFs are involved in reading comprehension. For early literacy, we see that response inhibition and cognitive flexibility are related to printed knowledge, and working memory is related only to phonological awareness. However, this picture may change across lifespan. So in older children, we can see that working memory and inhibition of irrelevant stimuli are important in reading comprehension and in reading in general. So as we grow up, we do not read only in order to answer to certain questions, but we rather read in order to acquire broader knowledge. So we need more cognitive and metacognitive skills. Now, working memory limitations, planning difficulties, poor inference making, and ineffective ineffective comprehension monitoring can impact negatively reading comprehension. There is evidence from struggling learners, dyslexic children, and children with specific language impairment that show that reading ability relates to executive functions. So many studies draw upon these evidence that comes from these groups in order to gain a better knowledge among the interaction that takes place between executive functions and reading skills. However, when we talk about academic achievement, we must include, of course, mathematical achievement. Even in mathematical achievement, we see that executive functions play a fundamental role. So in early mathematical skills, response inhibition is related to most components. And here we talk about components that regard the combination and the comparison of numbers and quantities. Moving on to working memory, it is related to more advanced mathematical skills, and cognitive flexibility is related to more conceptual or abstract mathematical skills. Overall, we can say that mathematical achievement is linked, of course, to domain-specific factual knowledge, to procedural skill, to conceptual understanding, and general executive function skills. It has been found that inhibitory control and working memory can influence mathematics achievement. Here we need to say that working memory indirectly affects mathematics achievement, and this is because working memory is linked to the construction and identification of the mathematical problem. So this is why it indirectly affects mathematics achievement. Now, moving on to executive functions in relation to ADHD. Of course, executive function measures are very useful, and we need them in order to identify individuals with ADHD. Executive functions may vary, and may vary in ADHD because we have ADHD individuals that do not exhibit executive dysfunction, or they may exhibit some problems, some deficits in executive functions, but they do not exhibit the same dysfunction. So we do not have the same degree of dysfunction or the same deficits. ADHD appears to have some core deficits that may in turn cause secondary deficits in executive functions. This is one speculation. However, there is another model that says that we have multiple deficient executive functions. The areas that seem to be affected in ADHD are vigilance, cognitive inhibition, motor inhibition, set shifting, planning, sorting, and working memory. We have impaired executive functions, and these can relate to structural and pragmatic deficits. But we need to be very careful. When we talk about pragmatic deficits, we do not mean that individuals with ADHD do not have the knowledge of pragmatic conventions. They have the appropriate knowledge, but they have difficulties in applying actually effectively the conventions they are aware of. So, weaknesses in executive functions correlate with the symptoms in ADHD, and more specifically, they link to the severity of the symptoms. The severity of ADHD symptoms has been found to be a better predictor of reading and writing skills than the measures of executive functions themselves. However, this is not always the case, because we have executive function deficits that are evidenced even after controlling for the effect of ADHD symptoms. So, executive functions along with ADHD symptoms appear to exert a crucial influence on the learning behaviors of individuals with ADHD. At this point, it is important, however, to note that there are other factors that may affect learning. So motivation is, again, very important in ADHD. So there is some evidence indicating that difference in EF tasks may become not significant or not that significant in older age. There are indications that we have executive function subtypes in ADHD, and this is very important because we can say that the different subtypes of executive functions will have different effects on children with ADHD. So we may be capable of designing better interventions for children with ADHD. And of course, we may be able, if we establish, of course, the EF subtypes in ADHD, to enhance the diagnosis of each subtype in the specific developmental disorder. So, ADHD children have been found to perform poorly on EF tasks despite having an average academic achievement. However, again, this is not always the case. So we have impaired academic achievement that has been associated with ADHD, despite children and individuals in general having average or within the low average range performance on EF tasks. Overall, ADHD seems to affect social and school functioning, and executive functions seem to affect school functioning. So, executive functions deficit may exacerbate the academic difficulties for children with intense ADHD symptoms. So, children with both ADHD and effective executive function deficits run an increased risk for academic impairment compared to children that do not have EF deficits, but they may have ADHD. So, behavioral inattention may lead to reading difficulties. Behavioral inattention is very important even in preschool age. So, behavioral inattention in kindergarten has been linked to difficulties in reading comprehension and generally in reading skills and mathematics skills later on in the first grade. And this is even after we control for the effect of early literacy skills like the letter knowledge or phonemic awareness. We may also say, however, that there are underlying executive function deficits, and especially in working memory, that result to both short attention spans and literacy problems. And now we will try to draw some conclusions. First of all, we are aware that ADHD is a very heterogeneous group. We have the subtypes of ADHD. Moving on to executive function deficits, we have mixed results. So sometimes we may trace executive dysfunction, sometimes we may not trace executive dysfunction. As far as academic difficulty is concerned, of course, we can say that this domain may be linked to executive function problems, but this is not the case in all the body of the research. So we need more research in order for us to be able to see the exact interactions that take place among academic difficulties, ADHD symptoms, and executive function deficits. Thank you very much for your attention.